In 2004 and 2005, the New York Historical Society hosted what turned out to be their most highly attended exhibit in their history. The exhibit was Slavery in New York. Some of you may have attended that exhibit. I see some nodding. It was a big deal. People flocked to it because, though it shouldn't have been news, it was news to New Yorkers that slavery had been part and parcel, part of the absolute fabric of this city from its inception. So London's story is no exception. And the symbolism of the discovery of the African burial ground under Wall Street is profound and apt. You may or may not know that at the time, right after South Carolina seceded in 1861, some businessmen in Manhattan decided to call a meeting because they were so concerned not about how to contribute to anti-slavery, but about how their profits were going to be impacted by a potential civil war and secession. And not a few people came to that meeting, hundreds of people came to that meeting. And on the heels of that, the then mayor of New York, Fernando Wood, called for New York to not exactly secede, but become an independent city-state so that it could still do business with the North and the South. Just an anecdote or two to give you a flavor of how entrenched that economy was. Lehman Brothers, for those who haven't heard this as well, Lehman Brothers were cotton brokers. So the origins of that bank were in the cotton trade. I had my own personal reckoning, similar to New Yorkers' reckoning, when my grandmother sent me at age 28. I was 28, she was about 90. She sent a summary of our family history to all her grandchildren. And to her credit, there were 2 or 3 sentences in there that said that our ancestors in Rhode Island had been slave traders. Jumped off the page. I was in shock reading it, as you can well imagine. Then I had a second shock within moments, which is I realized that I already knew and had buried it. Someone who thought she was very self-aware and wouldn't do such a thing had buried it because it was too painful, too uncomfortable to face. So that was when I was 28. I was in seminary in California, and it felt like an absolute call to face it and to deal with it. So I started calling relatives, reading books, and I learned what my grandmother didn't know and what no one in my family knew, which was that the De Wolfs, that was their name, they were probably Dutch. The De Wolfs were actually the largest slave trading family in US history. By virtue of their involvement over 3 generations, they built up a dynasty with ships coming out of Rhode Island, Bristol, Rhode Island, rum distilleries in order to take rum to West Africa to trade for humans. They owned sugar plantations and coffee plantations in Cuba, so they basically sold people at auction and also had plantations, and it was just a probably about 50-year triangle that they operated over 3 generations. The time that I found this out also happened to be the time that your congregant, Mackie Alston, in collaboration with his partner, spouse, who was producer, they decided to produce a film called Family Name about Mackie's similar discovery about his southern ancestors having been slave owners. And the film came out on PBS, and I saw it, and I reached out to Mackie. Edward Ball had just written Slaves in the Family. So reaching out to both of them as a northern, call it a northern sister, with my northern sister's story, I am forever indebted to both Edward Ball and Mackie for encouraging me to do what I subsequently did, which is to make a film. I was not trained, I was not a filmmaker, so it was very much a case of following where my heart was taking me and where this story was taking me, and wanting to tell the story of not just Northern complicity, but Northern amnesia. That my family amnesia was absolutely parallel to Northern amnesia. The Mid-Atlantic states, New England, completely complicit in every kind of way you can imagine. The film, as you know, because we're about to show it today, is called Traces of the Trade, and I do echo the invitation for you to stay after if you're able to watch it. It came out in 2008. We had a PBS broadcast as well, and I've basically been on the road with the film ever since. So very much in dialogue with folks around the country about what does this history mean, what are the implications of it, and how can we contribute to repairing the breach. I think that's all I need to say by way of introduction about the film. And now I'm going to let you in on something, which is that, you know that whole business about reading a sermon versus doing it from notes? I have never given a sermon from notes, but today is the day. And it's not because I wasn't prepared. I had an entirely written sermon, but Spirit had its way with me, and when I read it, the second half of it kind of bugged me after a busy week and deadlines, and it just didn't feel quite right. And other things have been influencing me in the last week or so, like my cousin, Ledley Laughlin, passed away recently, and any of you might have known him. He was the Reverend at St. Luke's here in the neighborhood for many, many years, St. Luke's Episcopal. And in the tributes to him at his funeral last weekend, people were talking about how he would come on out. I'm inspired by Mrs. Maisels, for those of you who've watched the Amazon Prime series, and how she just kind of went for it as a stand-up comic. And I do dance improvisation, but I don't trust myself to do spoken improvisation. And I decided if there's any place you could try it out and experiment, it's got to be Judson Memorial Church. So is that okay with everybody? It will encourage me if, as I talk, I get some nods from the audience or some amens every once in a while. Okay, so I have no idea how long this will take, et cetera, whatever. You can just take the hook if needed at a point. So, okay, Isaiah, the reading, the ancient testimony. I love this passage. It's one of those it's those, what do you call it, conditional phrase or something. If this, and if this, then this. So we're gonna look at the two ifs. If you remove the yoke from among you, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted. In other words, first, do no harm. End slavery, which still needs ending today because it still goes on. And any form of economic exploitation, bondage, oppression, we need to end it. First, do no harm. And it's easier said than done, as I don't need to tell all of you. One of the wake-up calls for me on the journey that we took was to move beyond a simple good and evil, like there are just those evil slave traders like my ancestors, and I would never be one of them. Therefore, I must be a good person. Therefore, my conscience is clear. Not so. When you study how the slave trade and slavery actually worked at a granular economic level, you realize that it was propped up not just by people like my ancestors, but by consumers who bought all the products that were harvested by enslaved people. And it was propped up by regular, average people whose occupations were completely enmeshed in the slave-based economy. So the rope makers and the sail makers and the sugar distillers and everything kind of throughout the economy was implicated. So that begins to look a lot more like today and the types of things we do today, us good, average people. So easier said than done to remove the yoke. The second if statement, if you remove the pointing of the finger, the speaking of evil. And I'd like to spend some time with you guys with this one, more than the one I just shared about. If you remove the pointing of the finger, this has been, it's on my mind in so many kinds of ways. The first dates to when the film first came out and I started doing screenings in the South. And I've spent, like, up until then, I'd spent very little time in the South, so I hadn't had the opportunity to have revealed to me my prejudice against white Southerners. I heard Southern accents, and I had immediate stereotypes that those people were racist and less intelligent. And it was kind of shocking to notice and to admit. And from then, it's been just a stream of kind of self-revelations and realizations around how this white northern amnesia and construction of this story of kind of writing the history after winning the Civil War, writing the history books in our favor, that we were the abolitionists, that we were the good guys, and we went south to free the slaves. There's so much hypocrisy behind that historic narrative. And once you're aware of that, it's just a mind shift. It was for me, a complete mind shift around like, oh, we're making up stories about ourselves to make ourselves feel good. Is there maybe some truth in white Southern claims that we are arrogant and hypocrites and self-righteous, and why are we always telling them what to do? I never had ears for that before. I was always like, that's just those racist, less intelligent people feeling aggrieved. But I have a whole new frame on it now that I understand the depth and the breadth of Northern complicity in slavery and racism, clear on through up to the present day. You know, abolitionists came from the North, but they were the minority. They were the minority. So the pointing of the finger, so I have been called to remove my pointing of the finger at white Southerners. Not that they don't have responsibility to take, but I shouldn't be the one pointing fingers. The second case is more recent. This is post the 2016 presidential election. And all the work that started coming out by journalists and commentators about Trump voters who were working class white people and why they voted for Trump. And there's a book by Joan Williams called White Working Class about class cluelessness. And it was a hard look in the mirror because she basically names, she says, if you're not working class, and if you have a college education, you're in the professional managerial elite. And you probably don't like to think of yourself as the elite. You probably like to think of yourself as the middle class. But guess what? You know, if you're in the upper 20% of income, and if you have a college degree, you're in the elite, is her argument. And as part of that, she also is inviting us to notice the ways in which those of us who live in more affluent urban centers, on the coasts, et cetera, places like New York, not to make any assumptions about people's incomes here, of course, but for more affluent areas, what do we fully, deeply understand? Do we fully, deeply understand the disparate way in which the economic recovery took place, you know, in urban centers versus in the heartland, in the Midwest? So there's a way in the current, this is a whole topic unto itself, and I'm just gonna hint at it and would love to be in conversation with anyone subsequently. You know, there's a way in which, for those of us who are liberal and progressive, it's easy to point the finger at white working class people who can appear to us more racist than ourselves. But if you haven't economically been in the position that white poor and white working class people have been in, you might not, I don't think I fully understand. I know I don't have the lived experience to understand the kind of economic insecurity that might lead to feeling threatened by immigration, or to having opinions that we would find, problematic about complaining about Black entitlement programs and the takers versus the makers, these things that are highly offensive and highly problematic. But having less finger pointing and more trying to understand where white working class, and forgive my generalizations in all this as well, but I hope this looking in the mirror process can be really crucial in these divisive times that we're in, where we're coming apart, obviously, in all sorts of ways. So can we remove those kind of pointing of the finger as we deal with the current political crises? And the last one, bear with me because this is getting into some psychodynamics that don't roll off the tongue super easily, but coming back to Black-white dynamics, there's this amazing essay by James Baldwin that was published in Ebony magazine in 1964 or 5, I think, called White Man's Guilt. And he has this, has anyone read that before? Yeah. It's got this incredible description of the white psyche in conversation with the Black psyche, but all through projection, like what the white psyche projects onto Black people as to what white people think Black people are thinking about us. So it's this whole internal conversation that white people have. And he just very powerfully describes how white folks, even at the mere presence of someone of African descent, get caught up in either defensiveness or shame. And how, and then I would add, how unproductive those emotions can be at the end of the day. So in a funny way, I think of it as pointing a finger at ourselves based on this projection of Black people pointing at us. Some do, of course, but I've met so many people of African descent who've said, pay attention now. I'm not trying to blame you for slavery. I'm smarter than that. But I need you to pay attention to what's going on today. I need you to be my ally and my partner in dealing with racial justice today. That does not involve blame. That does not involve anything that you necessarily need to feel defensive or weighted down by. I need your full, live, embodied, empowered presence to be an ally in racial justice. So if that makes some sense, it's sort of removing the pointing of finger towards ourselves. And removing, yes, either the defensiveness or the shame. So then we get to the then, it's very hard to say, the then statement from Isaiah. Then your light shall rise in the darkness, and your gloom be like the noonday. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your needs in the parched places and make your bones strong. You shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water. And if you just take your imagination to your own life, your own self, what do you feel like when you feel defensive or when you feel shame? Do you feel like a watered garden? Probably not. Do you feel perhaps more dry, more constricted, smaller? Isaiah is saying, if you remove the pointing of the finger, if you remove the yoke from among you, you will be like a watered garden whose waters never cease. So I find this still so hard, I can confess to finding it so hard as a white and class privileged person to find the joy in this work and to remember that it's about reclaiming right relationship and the joy of reclaiming right relationship to myself, to my African descended brothers and sisters, to my different class, descended white brothers and sisters, that there's joy in showing up for each other with open hearts, undefended, in pursuit of beloved community. And in closing, I must read a quote from Rebecca Parker, the Unitarian Universalist reverend and theologian that some of you may have heard before. She writes, she's a white woman. She writes, "My commitment to racial justice is both on behalf of the other, my neighbor, whose well-being I desire, and for myself, to whom the gift of life has been given but not yet fully claimed. I struggle neither as a benevolent act of social concern nor as a repentant act of shame and guilt, but as an act of desire for life, of passion for life, of insistence on life, fueled by both love for life and anger in the face of the violence that divides human flesh." Amen.